The Anarchy, the East India Company, Corporate Violence, and the Pillage of an Empire by William Dalrymple. There's this everyday word you probably used recently without thinking twice about it. It's short, punchy, and it means to steal or plunder during war or chaos. The word is loot. Here's the twist, though. This wasn't always an English word. For centuries, it lived only in the dusty villages of northern India as loot, Hindustani slang for plunder. Then suddenly, in the late 1700s, it jumped across oceans and burrowed into the English language. And when you understand why, the whole story gets dark fast. Take a trip to Powys Castle, this imposing stone fortress tucked away in the Welsh countryside, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Step inside, and Wales completely disappears. You're suddenly drowning in the treasures of a conquered empire. Room after room overflows with imperial plunder ripped from India. Golden hookahs catch the light. Jeweled daggers line the walls. There are rubies, the deep red of pigeon's blood, and emeralds like shards of frozen green fire. Tiger heads studded with sapphires glare from pedestals. There's even the actual campaign tent of Tipu, the legendary tiger of Mysore. The castle is basically swimming in loot. And tucked away in a shadowy corner hangs this massive painting that tells you exactly how all this treasure ended up in Wales. It shows an Indian prince on his throne, handing a scroll to a slightly pudgy Englishman in a bright red coat. That Englishman is Robert Clive. The prince is Shah Alam, the Mughal emperor. And that scroll, that piece of paper is the key to everything. It's basically a document that hands over financial control of India's wealthiest provinces, Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, to a private company. Not to the British government, not to a king or queen, to a for-profit shareholder-owned corporation operating out of one tiny London office, literally 5 windows wide. This is the jaw-dropping story that historian William Dalrymple unpacks in his masterwork, The Anarchy. Critics have called it one of the most important historical books of our generation, a narrative so gripping it reads like a blockbuster thriller. Dalrymple, who spent much of his life living and writing in India, doesn't serve up some dry academic lecture about dates and treaties. He brings to life a breathing, chaotic world and tells the almost impossible-to-believe story of how a single business, in less than 50 years, managed to conquer an entire subcontinent. We casually say the British conquered India, but Dalrymple shows us that phrase hides a much darker truth. It was actually a dangerously unregulated private company, led by ruthless corporate predators, that first grabbed huge chunks of India for the sole purpose of making investors rich. So let me take you on a journey. We're going back to an age of emperors and merchants, of unimaginable wealth and brutal violence. By the end, you'll understand not just how a company conquered a country, but you'll also see a chilling warning about the terrifying power of unchecked corporate greed. You'll see how today's world was shaped not just by nations and armies, but by the relentless, insatiable hunger of a single corporation. This is the story of the East India Company. This is the story of the Anarchy. Our story doesn't start on some dramatic battlefield. It begins in a small, half-timbered hall in London in 1599. While William Shakespeare was probably scribbling away at Hamlet just across the Thames, a group of merchants, sailors, and adventurers gathered with a simple but bold plan. They were sick of buying spices like pepper and cloves from middlemen who jacked up the prices. They wanted to sail directly to the East Indies and cut out the middleman entirely. At the time, England was basically a poor backwater nation. Its early exploration attempts had been mostly disasters. Compared to the mighty Spanish and Portuguese with their sprawling global empires, the English were rank amateurs. Their most famous sailors were essentially government-approved pirates, like Sir Francis Drake, who made his reputation raiding Spanish treasure ships. The English had almost no experience with long-distance trade. But they were ambitious, and they had this revolutionary new idea, the joint stock company. It was a way for merchants to pool resources and bring in outside investors to fund ventures no single person could afford. It was a corporation, a legal entity that could outlive its founders, with shares anyone could buy and sell. So, on the very last day of 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to 218 men. They called themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. We just call it the East India Company. At birth, it was tiny. Its starting capital was a fraction of its Dutch rival, the VOC. Its first voyage, led by Sir James Lancaster, was funded with just over £30,000. It was a dangerous journey, but it returned massive profits, mostly because Lancaster did what English sailors did best. He captured a Portuguese ship and looted its cargo of pepper. For years, the company remained a modest player, struggling against the much wealthier and better organized Dutch. But after the Dutch brutally massacred English traders in the Spice Islands, the company decided to pivot. Instead of chasing spices, they'd trade in textiles, and the source for the world's finest textiles was India. When the company first showed up in India in the early 1600s, it entered a world of staggering wealth and power. This was the Mughal Empire, one of the richest and most powerful empires on the planet. It ruled over 150 million people and produced nearly a quarter of the world's manufactured goods. Its cities were megacities, swarming with merchants from across Asia. The Mughal emperor Jahangir was fabulously wealthy, and his court was a place of mind-blowing splendor. When King James I sent an official ambassador, Sir Thomas Roe, to the Mughal court in 1615, the English were treated like mildly interesting beggars. Roe, a courtier and diplomat, tried to negotiate trade agreements. But Emperor Jahangir was way more interested in Roe's hunting dogs and the weird European paintings he'd brought as gifts. Jahangir was a passionate collector of curiosities, and he viewed these Englishmen with about as much interest as the first Turkey to arrive in India. There's this famous Mughal painting from the period that perfectly captures the power dynamic. It shows Emperor Jahangir on his throne, with a divine halo glowing behind him. He's turning to speak with a holy man, completely ignoring the other world leaders depicted at his feet. Tucked way down in the bottom corner, almost cropped out, is a small portrait of King James I of England, looking sullen and completely insignificant. To the mighty Mughals, these scruffy traders from a foggy northern island were barely worth noticing. To trade successfully, the company realized it couldn't use force. It had to play by Mughal rules, and for a century, that's exactly what it did. It slowly learned court customs, mastered the art of bribery, and picked up Persian. It established small trading posts, or factories, in coastal cities like Surat, Madras, and eventually Calcutta. It acted like a humble merchant, always seeking permission and showing respect to Mughal authorities. This strategy paid off. The company's trade in Indian textiles boomed, and profits grew steadily. Then, in 1707, everything changed. The great, formidable, and puritanical Emperor Aurangzeb died. Aurangzeb had been a brilliant general, but his intolerance and endless wars had stretched the empire to breaking point. His death unleashed a storm of succession crises and civil wars. 3 of his successors were murdered. In just 1719, 4 different emperors sat on the throne. The once mighty Mughal Empire began to shatter. Regional governors, known as nawabs, started ruling their provinces like independent kings. And a new formidable power rose in the west, the Marathas. Originally peasant warriors, the Marathas were masters of lightning-fast cavalry raids. Led by their charismatic leader, Shivaji, they'd been a thorn in Aurangzeb's side. Now they swept across central India, carving out their own vast confederacy from the crumbling Mughal state. As one contemporary historian, Ghulam Hussain Khan, wrote, the once peaceful realm of India became an, quote, abode of anarchy. In this chaos, the European trading companies spotted their opportunity. And the first to really understand the new rules wasn't the English, but their great rival, the French. The French governor in India, a brilliant and ambitious man named Joseph François Dupleix, realized something crucial. In this new, fractured India, a small but well-trained and disciplined army of Indian soldiers, drilled European style and led by European officers, could be a game-changer. These soldiers were called sepoys, from the Persian word sipahi. Dupleix began renting out his new sepoy army to rival Indian princes, playing kingmaker in their local disputes. In return, he got land, trading rights, and immense wealth. He was transforming his trading company into a military and political power. The English East India Company took notes, and they had a young man in their service who would prove even more ruthless and effective at this new game than Dupleix. His name was Robert Clive. Clive was an unlikely hero. He'd been shipped to India as a junior accountant, a writer, basically because he was too unruly and violent for a respectable career back in England. He was moody, difficult, and hated India. He suffered from severe depression and even tried to kill himself. He had zero military training. But he possessed breathtaking audacity, a street fighter's instinct, and reckless bravery. When the Anglo-French rivalry in Europe spilled into India, Clive found his calling in what he called the military sphere. In a series of conflicts known as the Carnatic Wars, Clive, leading the company's newly raised sepoy forces, outmaneuvered and crushed Dupleix's French armies. The student had destroyed the master. Clive returned to England a wealthy hero, but a failed stab at politics left him broke and humiliated. He needed to get back to India to make a second fortune. And the company, now facing a new global war with France, the 7 Years' War, desperately needed its most brilliant, if unconventional, general. The stage for the next great act was Bengal. Bengal was the richest province of the Mughal Empire. Its fertile lands produced vast surpluses of rice, and its million weavers created the world's most desired silks and muslins. It was, quite simply, the jewel in the Mughal crown. It was ruled by a wise and capable old Nawab, Aliverdi Khan, who'd maintained a rare island of peace and prosperity. Aliverdi understood the Europeans. He once told his generals they were like a hive of bees, of whose honey you might reap benefit, but if you disturbed their hive, they would sting you to death. But Aliverdi was old, and his chosen heir was his grandson, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. By all contemporary accounts, Indian, French, and English, Siraj was a disaster. He was cruel, ignorant, and psychopathic, known for his debauchery and violence. One historian, his own cousin, describes him as a serial rapist who enjoyed drowning boatloads of innocent people for fun. He'd alienated almost everyone at court, including the most powerful figures in Bengal, the great bankers known as the Jagat Seths, a family so wealthy they were called the bankers of the world. When old Nawab Aliverdi Khan finally died in April 1756, Siraj-ud-Dowlah took the throne. He immediately got suspicious of the English in Calcutta, who, fearing war with France, had started strengthening their fortifications without his permission. Siraj saw this as a direct challenge to his authority. "What honor is left to us," he asked, "when a few traitors, who have not yet learned to wash their bottoms, defy a ruler's order?" In a lightning campaign, he marched on Calcutta. The company's defenses were pathetic, its leadership incompetent. The governor, Roger Drake, literally fled on a ship, abandoning his men. The city fell in days. The capture of Calcutta was humiliating, but what happened next echoed through British history for centuries. The captured English garrison was herded into a tiny punishment cell, a cramped guard room, just 18 feet long, with little air and no water. In the suffocating heat of a Bengali June, most died overnight. The incident became infamous as the Black Hole of Calcutta. For the company, losing Calcutta was a devastating economic blow. Its most profitable trading post was gone, but for Robert Clive, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He was sent from Madras, leading a relief force. In a series of swift and brilliant moves, Clive retook Calcutta and forced a terrified Siraj-ud-Dowlah to sign a treaty restoring all the company's privileges. And there, the story might have ended. But a new player had entered the game. The Jagat Seths, the great bankers of Bengal, along with a group of disaffected generals led by a veteran commander named Mir Jafar, had decided they couldn't tolerate Siraj's rule anymore. They'd seen Clive's military skill and decided to reach out to the company. They proposed a conspiracy. If the company would use its army to help overthrow Siraj, they'd replace him with the more pliable Mir Jafar. In return, they offered the company an astronomical sum, the equivalent of Bengal's entire annual revenue. This was something completely new in Indian history, a group of Indian financiers plotting with an international corporation to use its private army to stage a coup. Clive, ever the opportunist, jumped at it. The climax came in June 1757, in a mango grove near a village called Plassey. Clive's small army of 800 Europeans and 2,200 sepoys faced Siraj-ud-Dowlah's massive force of 50,000. On paper, it was suicide. But the Battle of Plassey wasn't really a battle, it was a transaction. As the two armies squared off, a sudden monsoon downpour soaked the Nawab's gunpowder, making his cannons useless. But the real betrayal came from within. Mir Jafar, who commanded a huge chunk of Siraj's army, stood by and did nothing, exactly as he'd promised Clive. Another of Siraj's key commanders had also been bribed. The battle was over before it really began. Siraj's army fell apart, and he fled on a camel. He was captured days later and brutally murdered on the orders of Mir Jafar's son. Clive marched into the Bengali capital, Murshidabad, as a conqueror. He installed Mir Jafar on the throne and then headed straight to the treasury. The entire contents were loaded onto 100 boats and floated down the river to the company's headquarters in Calcutta. The prize money was staggering. A huge chunk went directly into Clive's pocket, making him the richest self-made man in Europe. The rest went to the company and its officers. But Plassey was about way more than just money. It was the moment the company transformed. It wasn't just a trading corporation anymore. It was now a kingmaker, the dominant military power in India's richest province. Yet even this wasn't the final act. The greatest prize was still to come. After the chaos following Plassey, and another even more decisive victory at the Battle of Buxar in 1765, the company's forces found themselves masters of not just Bengal, but all of northeastern India. They'd also, by chance, captured the Mughal emperor himself, the now wandering and powerless Shah Alam. It was in August 1765, in his tent at Allahabad, that Clive pulled off his final, most audacious masterstroke. He sat Emperor Shah Alam on his own dining room table, draped with a chintz bedspread, and forced him to sign a document. This document was the Diwani. It granted the East India Company the legal right to collect taxes for the 3 provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, a territory of 20 million people. In return, the emperor would get a handsome pension. With one signature, a private corporation had become a sovereign power. The transition was complete. A company of merchants, based in a small London office, now held the financial and administrative control of a vast Indian territory, all protected by its own private army. For the people of Bengal, the consequences were catastrophic. The company's rule quickly became what the British themselves described as, quote, the shaking of the pagoda tree. It was a period of unregulated plunder and asset stripping. With no stake in the country's long-term well-being, company officials cared only about extracting as much wealth as possible, as fast as possible. Bengal's wealth, which for centuries had drawn traders from across the world, was now systematically drained and shipped to Britain. Indian weavers and artisans were forced to work for the company at starvation wages. The final horrific result of this corporate greed came in 1770. A terrible famine, made infinitely worse by the company's policies, swept through Bengal. While company merchants hoarded grain and speculated on rising prices, the company itself not only failed to provide relief, but actually increased tax collection. Platoons of sepoys were sent into the countryside to enforce payment, erecting gibbets to hang those who resisted. Perhaps 1 in 5 Bengalis, as many as 1.2 million people, starved to death. It was one of the greatest failures of corporate responsibility in history. Back in London, as news of the famine and rampant corruption trickled home, public opinion began turning against the company. Horace Walpole wrote, "We have outdone the Spaniards in Peru. The groans of India have mounted to heaven." The company's share price collapsed. It was on the verge of bankruptcy. In a scene that feels eerily familiar today, this massive corporation, deemed too big to fail, had to go to the British government and beg for a colossal bailout. Parliament agreed to the loan, but there was a price. The government passed the Regulating Act of 1773, the first step in bringing the rogue corporation under state control. The company's Indian possessions would now be overseen by a governor-general, appointed by Parliament. The first man to hold this post was Warren Hastings. Hastings was completely different from Clive. He was a scholar, a linguist, and a genuine admirer of Indian culture. He'd lived in India since his teens and spoke fluent Bengali, Urdu, and Persian. He was appalled by the corruption around him and worked tirelessly to reform the company's administration and make its rule more just. But he was constantly undermined by rivals on the new council, particularly a venomous and ambitious politician named Philip Francis, who was determined to destroy him. After years of bitter feuding, which even resulted in a duel where Hastings shot Francis, Francis returned to London. There, he allied himself with the great orator Edmund Burke and began a campaign to have Hastings impeached for corruption and tyranny. The impeachment of Warren Hastings, which began in 1788, became the great political spectacle of the age. For 7 years, Burke and his fellow prosecutors accused Hastings of being the, quote, Captain General of iniquity, responsible for the rape and plunder of India. In the end, Hastings was acquitted of all charges, but the trial served as a powerful symbol. Parliament had put the company's empire on trial, and it marked the beginning of the end for the company's untamed power. But the story of the company's conquest wasn't over yet. 2 major Indian powers still stood in its way. In the south, there was the formidable Sultanate of Mysore, ruled first by the brilliant General Hyder Ali, then by his even more famous son, Tipu Sultan. Tipu was a relentless and innovative warrior, a modernizer who imported French technology and embraced European military tactics to use against the British. He was the company's most feared enemy, known as the Tiger of Mysore. And across western and central India, there was the still mighty Maratha Confederacy. Though weakened by internal divisions, their armies were vast and their cavalry legendary. In 1780, these 2 powers, along with the Nizam of Hyderabad, formed a triple alliance aimed at expelling the British from India. That same year, at the Battle of Polalur, Tipu and his father inflicted a devastating defeat on a company army, the most severe blow the British had ever suffered in India. For a moment, it seemed like the company's Indian adventure might be over. The British Empire was teetering everywhere. This was the same period they were losing the American colonies to George Washington. But the company survived. It was saved by Warren Hastings' clever diplomacy, which broke the Indian alliance, and by the sheer depth of its financial resources. The company could always raise more money and field more troops than any of its Indian rivals. The final act of conquest began with the arrival of a new governor-general in 1798, Richard Wellesley. Wellesley was an unabashed imperialist. He despised the mercantile spirit of the company and saw it simply as an instrument for expanding the British Empire. His goal wasn't trade, but total domination. His first target was Tipu Sultan. In 1799, Wellesley unleashed a massive, overwhelming force against Mysore. The capital, Srirangapatnam, was stormed. Tipu Sultan, refusing to surrender, died fighting in the breach, sword in hand. His kingdom was dismembered, his treasury looted. With Tipu gone, only the Marathas remained, and they, tragically, proceeded to destroy themselves. A bitter civil war broke out between the young, inexperienced leaders of the Maratha houses of Scindia and Holkar. Wellesley brilliantly exploited these divisions. He followed the old Roman maxim, divide et impera, divide and rule. He backed one faction against the other, and when they'd exhausted themselves, he turned on them both. The decisive campaign came in 1803. Two company armies, one in the south, led by Wellesley's younger brother, Arthur, the future Duke of Wellington, and one in the north led by the 60-year-old veteran Lord Lake, advanced into Maratha territory. At the Battle of Assaye, Arthur Wellesley fought and won one of the hardest battles of his entire career, later saying it was tougher than Waterloo. But the main prize lay in the north. Lord Lake's objective was the ancient Mughal capital, Delhi. There, the now 75-year-old, blind Emperor Shah Alam still sat on a replica of the peacock throne, a powerless pawn in Maratha hands. He'd outlived all his enemies, Clive, Ghulam Qadir, Imadul Mulk, but he was a prisoner in his own palace, the ruler of a largely imaginary empire. On September 11, 1803, at the Battle of Delhi, Lake's army defeated the last major Maratha force in northern India. 5 days later, Lord Lake rode into the Red Fort. He was ushered into the emperor's presence. The British general found the descendant of the great Mughals, an object of pity, blinded and aged, stripped of authority, and reduced to poverty, seated under a small tattered canopy, the fragment of regal state and the mockery of human pride. Lake bowed before the sightless monarch and announced that he'd come to offer him British protection. The conquest was complete. A commercial corporation had come to replace the Mughals as masters of India. In less than half a century, the East India Company had gone from being a supplicant trader to the de facto ruler of a subcontinent. The anarchy was over, but a new, corporate empire had been born. So what are we supposed to make of this incredible and often horrifying story? William Dalrymple's The Anarchy is way more than just a history book. It's a profound meditation on power, greed, and the birth of the modern world. It forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth, that the British Empire in India wasn't born from some grand national project, but from the actions of a private corporation driven by the relentless pursuit of profit. One of the most powerful lessons of the book is how easily a state can be hijacked by corporate power. The East India Company didn't just trade. It lobbied, it bribed, and it used its immense wealth to influence Parliament back in London. Returned nabobs, like Clive, bought seats in the House of Commons, making sure the government's policies always favored the company's interests. The state and the corporation became locked in an intimate and often toxic dance. The company used state power, the Royal Navy and Army, to protect its commercial interests, while the state came to rely on the wealth generated by the company's Indian conquests. This story feels chillingly relevant today. We live in an age where multinational corporations wield enormous power, sometimes rivaling nation-states. They can influence elections, shape legislation, and, as we saw in the 2008 financial crisis, their failures can bring entire economies to their knees. The story of the East India Company is history's starkest warning about what happens when corporate power is unchecked and unaccountable. It's the original story of a company that became too big to fail, but the book also offers a more personal, human lesson. It shows us how ordinary people, driven by ambition and opportunity, can be capable of both extraordinary bravery and terrible cruelty. Figures like Robert Clive aren't simple villains. He was a man of immense talent and courage, but also of profound flaws, a corporate predator who acted with complete moral recklessness when it came to enriching himself and his company. The story of Shah Alam, the blind emperor, is equally powerful. His life was a tragedy of almost Shakespearean proportions. He was born into immense privilege, but lived to see his empire crumble, his family brutalized, and his own eyes gouged out. Yet through it all, he never lost his dignity or his belief in his divinely appointed role. He is a symbol of an old world, a world of honor, poetry, and courtly grace, being swept away by a new, more ruthless age of corporate calculation. So what can we take away from this? The first step, I think, is simply awareness. To understand the world we live in, we have to understand how it was made. We need to be aware of the complex relationship between governments and corporations. and to question who truly holds power in our societies. The second is a sense of humility. The story of the company's conquest of India wasn't inevitable. It was a product of chance, of individual decisions, and of the fatal divisions within Indian society itself. The Mughal Empire didn't fall just because the company was strong. It fell because it was already rotting from within. It's a reminder that no power, no matter how great, is permanent. That was a summary of The Anarchy by William Dalrymple. We've touched on the grand sweep of this epic story today, but I have to be honest with you. A summary can only ever be a map. It can't replace the experience of walking the terrain yourself. The real power of this book lies in the details. The vivid descriptions, the personal letters, the voices of the people who lived through this chaotic time. This summary is here to help you decide if this journey is one you want to take. If any part of this story has sparked your curiosity or stirred your sense of justice, then I urge you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's about understanding the very DNA of the modern world and the timeless struggle between power and morality. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book on Billionaire's Bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.